Last week, when I was on holiday, I have to say, it was very nice. It's great to be back. It's great to be back. I don't miss in any way the lovely semi-liquid gorgonzola or the cheese or any of that stuff. But last week, Jim started a series for us on women in the Bible and what we can learn from their stories. There are some amazing characters in the Bible. Because the Bible was written, most of it, a very long time ago. It was written in a society, in a culture that men were much more important than women. And so most of the characters and most of the stories that you get there are about men. And where there are women, very often it's a wee kind of add-on to the story. And so I think it's important that we don't overlook the parts that women play. In history, the Bible has been used to justify lots of different things, a lot of which aren't actually true. But people take verses, they take them out of context, or they interpret them in a particular way in order to support their own argument. The reading that we had today, for many years in South Africa and in America, was used to justify a stance against interracial marriage because of this debate about the woman who was from a different culture that Moses had married and how wrong that was. So I thought it would be good in a day when even now in the church across the world there are arguments about the role of women in leadership in the church. So I thought we should look at some women in the Bible and see what we can learn from them. And many of them we've not talked about before. Some of them we have. First though, having said all that, I want to tell you about a man. Do you know, who knew? A man who decided to join a monastery, one where there was a vow of silence, except on your birthday. On your birthday, you were allowed to speak 2 words. So you had to choose them carefully. So, on his birthday, our man arrives at the office of the abbot, takes a wee seat, and the abbot, who is allowed to speak on these occasions, says, "Well, Andrew, you've been a monk with us for almost a year, and it's your birthday, so you're allowed 2 words. What would you like to say?" And he went, "Bad food." "All right," says the abbot, and he wrote it down in his book. Next year, Andrew arrived at the abbot's office and he took his seat. And he said, "Well, Andrew, what would you like to say this year?" He said, "Bed's hard." So the abbot wrote it down in his wee book. And then during the 3rd year, when Andrew was called into the office, he didn't even bother taking his seat. He just came in and said, "Work's boring." At which point, the abbot said, "Right, that's it, you're out. Get out of this monastery." "What have I done?" He says, "You've done nothing but moan since you came here." Sometimes when we're complaining about everything except the very thing that irritates us and bothers us. We avoid talking about what we think the real problem is by complaining about something that is unrelated. And that's what we find in this passage this morning. We see Miriam complaining about one thing when actually it's something else altogether that's really irritated her. Notice, though, that God intervenes and Miriam suffers what seems to be a fairly harsh punishment for simply complaining. I think that's because she's not simply complaining. It's much more complicated than that. Here's someone who has been truly blessed by God. She's been given wisdom and talent and insight. She's blessed to be one of the leaders that God has chosen to lead the people from Israel into the promised land. She's leading alongside her brothers Moses and Aaron. And what she does is to look past her blessing and become jealous and envious of what God has given to her brother Moses. And it's that God reacts to. When you read in different versions of the Bible, you see right there in verse 1, it says, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, because he had married a Cushite. Now, I grew up in the era when they didn't teach grammar at schools. Nobody needed grammar when I was at school. And so, what I'm going to say next, I don't really understand. But there's a problem translating this passage from Hebrew into English because it is written in the third person feminine singular. Absolutely. Oh, right. I get it now, you all cry. Right? So, when you translate it into English, it says they began. What it actually means is that she began. She complained, she moaned, she was doing the talking, and Aaron did nothing. But by doing nothing, he is complicit in what is going on. I don't know how you would translate all of that into English, but that's what it means. He is, in effect, agreeing with her because he doesn't speak out. What's she complaining about? Well, the complaint on the face of it is about Moses' wife, a woman from Cush. And in Hebrew, and older translations and older commentaries on the Bible say that Cush was Ethiopia. And so when you go to Egypt and you look at the hieroglyphs, there are often very dark-skinned people portrayed in the hieroglyphs because there was fighting between the Ethiopians and the Egyptians. There were trade between them. There was slavery going backwards and forwards between them. But they played an important role in the history of Egypt. So there were Ethiopian folks there in Egypt. But it can also, as we subsequently learn over the years, relate to what is now Saudi Arabia and the area around there, which in those days was Midian. And that's where Moses went much earlier in the story. And so, whether Moses' wife was a second wife, or a black wife, or his first wife, who was the Midianite called Zipporah, Aaron and Miriam are trying to suggest that somehow this woman was inappropriate to be married to a leader of God's people. We don't know if it was because she was, if you like, an extra wife, if it was polygamous, or if it was a second wife after Zipporah had died or divorced, or if it was in fact Zipporah herself. But what we can be sure of, it was nothing to do with her. This argument actually was not about that at all. So here's Miriam, and in this part of the story, she is the complainer. She's the one who looks past all of the things that God has given to her and that she has been blessed by. Her speech is hostile, and her questions are rhetorical. She asks a question, but she's not actually looking for the answer. Her questions actually become accusations. Numbers 12:2. Has the Lord only spoken through Moses? It's like, really? No. Prophetess here. It becomes an accusation. Hasn't he also spoken through us? Miriam is piling up perceived problems to make her complaint sound stronger. But notice that God intervenes. Numbers 12:5. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, and he stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Well, I would imagine that kind of summons wasn't good. You would not want that kind of summons from God. It wasn't uncommon. God came down to the tent of meeting in the cloud, and he spoke there with Moses. And so the people were familiar with that, but here it's summoned before God. And so in verse 3, there's a mention obviously added later, because if Moses puts in Moses is the most humble person on the whole earth, Moses obviously is not the most humble person in the whole earth. Right? Because you can't get away with that. I'm so good. That doesn't work. Right? So it's a later add-in. But it's to remind us that Moses, unlikely to challenge this talk and these questioning comments that are coming from the other two. He wouldn't have been assertive about it. He chose rather to let God take care of things, so God takes care of it. Miriam's not happy with God's plan in her life. She wants what Moses has. But she's already got so much. And I think at this point we should remind ourselves and just point out again that Moses, Aaron, and Miriam are all in their 80s. Miriam was maybe even 90 by now. These are not teenagers falling out and bickering and arguing. These are people who should have known better. Not that any 80-year-olds in this place would ever complain or moan or fall out with each other. We understand that. But they should have known better. They really should. It's not a squabble amongst young people who are still learning about life. These are people who have led a tremendous life, who have seen incredible things that God has done for them. But apparently it's not enough for Miriam, at least, anymore. In Micah chapter 6, verse 4, it says this: I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. This isn't an afterthought. She's not there because she's a relative. She's not there in a secondary role. She's there because God has called her and put her in that place. She's not just the sister. God has chosen her to be one of the 3 people who is to lead the Israelites from slavery to the promised land. We first see her way back in Exodus chapter 2 as a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She seems to be quite sharp. She's certainly quite wise. She watches Moses in the basket floating down the river. Because in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, we're told there, Pharaoh gave this order to the people. Every boy that is born, every Israelite boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. So in order to save her son, Moses' mother puts him in the basket, she puts him in the water, and Miriam watches what happens to the baby. When the basket ends up in the hands of Pharaoh's daughter, Miriam has enough sense about her to run and to say, I know a nursemaid. I'll get you somebody who will look after the child. And goes for her mum. So Moses' mum ends up being the one that looks after Moses. And that was Miriam that did that. It was Miriam that sorted that. God used her even then as a child to protect Moses. As I said earlier, she is the first person to be described as a prophetess in the Bible. And in Exodus chapter 15, we see her in action in her role as a worship leader. After the sea has gone back and the Egyptians are destroyed, it says there in Exodus 15, 20 and 21, Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with tambourines and with dancing. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea." She leads them in song and dance, worshipping God for all that he's done for them and saving them from certain death. And so here we are in our reading this morning. She now wants that place that was given to Moses. And in doing so, she shows jealousy. But she also minimizes the call of God in her own life and the role that she is expected by God to play. And so she is summoned by God. She's there because she made the complaints. Aaron's there because he's been silent. How much trouble could have been avoided in congregations if leaders and elders had simply spoken up against the bullying or the gossip or the slander, or if they had taken a stand for what they knew to be right instead of remaining silent. It does no good to come out of a meeting and say, they really shouldn't have said that, if you've not spoken up at the time. And I know because I've done it. and then regretted it afterwards. So Numbers 12, verses 6 to 9. God says, listen to my words. When there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions, and I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all of my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why, then, were you not afraid to speak against him? Why were you not afraid? Here's the guy that I've chosen. Here's the guy that I spend time with. Here's the guy that I have the deep relationship with. Here's the guy who, above everybody else in the land, is the one I want to be with. So why were you not afraid to go against him? They had to be reminded that Moses' relationship with God was in a different league to their relationship with God. It's not that God hadn't spoken to them. It's not that God hadn't used them. God had given them dreams and visions. He had called them to lead the people. But he hadn't called them to be Moses. Only Moses was called to be Moses. And God spoke more directly and regularly to Moses. And that was done out in the open where everyone could see. When God came down in the cloud of smoke to see Moses and to speak with Moses, and they went into the tent of meeting. That was in public, and people stopped and they could see it happening. And so the question is, if the whole nation could see God speaking to Moses on a regular basis, when did they see God speaking to Miriam? And the answer is they don't. Because that wasn't the relationship. That wasn't the call on her life. The Bible is quite clear that this opposition to Moses wasn't about his wife at all. The issue was whether Aaron and Miriam had enough recognition and power. And if you look closely at most church conflict, you'll discover that no matter what people tell you it's about, even if it's allegedly doctrinal issues or spiritual practices, it's probably about individual ego and selfishness. I've got a wee picture. It says, I think the church needs a conflict management plan. Don't know if you've ever been in a meeting like that. No, I have. And then you get, rubbish! It's a great idea. What would you know? Been in there too, huh? What would you know? Leave him alone, you dictator. Could we talk about something else, please? As we come as a congregation to face a future where there is a question over the shape of ministry in Prestwick, we will no doubt face some of these issues. Sometimes people will tell you they're upset over something in the church and use a potential controversy to illustrate their point. I suspect we'll hear a lot of our building, our communion table, our Bible translation, our whatever it is, as we try to move forward in bringing people together. And what we need to remember is that we need to listen, because I think we'll discover that actually the issue is more about hurt feelings or feeling disenfranchised. We'll discover that it's not really the red flag about the communion table at all. It's about them and how they feel. And so then what we need is for people to be, firstly, stronger than Aaron. We're going to need people who tell the truth and stand up for the truth and speak the truth, who are able to identify the real issue at hand, call it for what it is, even at the risk of upsetting others. But we're also going to need people who are more like the younger Miriam, to have the courage she showed in protecting her baby brother, and the wisdom she had to identify where God had been at work and to lead others to recognize it and to rejoice in it, to lead them to worship. We're going to need people who recognize and understand the call of God on their life and who are prepared to do what God has asked them to do. Not more and not less, but to be obedient to his call on us. To remember that we are blessed. To remember all that God has done for us and in us and through us in the past. And that he still has things to do for us and in us and through us in the future. to trust him and to walk with him.